Hello, this is an explanation on how you might use a style sheet to style a form. Now, I've done a screencast like this before, but in the previous screencast I was using the method of linking labels to inputs using the ID. So just to remind you, you'd have a label tag, except I've misspelled label. You'd have a label tag, let's call it surname. And then you might have an input, remember you must have the name property because that's what's sent. But if I want to link that label to that input for accessibility purposes so that the user who might have motor control difficulty can click on the word and it would put the focus in the input, then I have to somehow link that label to that input by adding an ID property. So I say ID equals, SN for S name, and then in the label I can say that this label is for SN. But the two, you have to have the for attribute and you have to have the ID attribute to link the two together. In HTML5, the label can actually enclose the input. So there's the start label and there's the end label, and that more obviously links that label to that input. It also has the advantage that the HTML is cleaner in that there's no for attribute there and there's no ID attribute there, which we don't need. The input only needs the name attribute. However, when it comes to styling that, we have to do things slightly differently because the input is inside the label. They're not two separate things which we can move independently. So that's the problem. So this is what the thing looks like on the screen, the form looks like on the screen. I've put a field set around it. I've made the field set have a width of 50% just so it looks nice. And somehow the first step, I guess, is to move these labels, which are inline elements of course, onto their own line. So let's do that as the first step. This is my idea, by the way, of what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and align the text in the label on the right and then push it over to the left by having a large amount of right padding. But you can read that as we go along. Let's start then. So what are we saying? A label should have these qualities. It should be display block. Because by default it's an inline element. If I save that and come back here, they go underneath each other. It would be nice to have a bit of space between them, so I'm not going to push this down, but I am going to push that away by adding some margin bottom. So I'm going to say margin bottom, let's just make it 1 EM, in other words the letter M width as a measurement, it's a relative measure, so that looks nice. So let me now align these so that they align right, because it would be nice to have the E there lined up with the E there. So I'm going to do that. Text align right, save that, and that looks okay. But the problem is they're all the way over here, of course. Well, I want to push them over here. So inside the border, the thing that gives you space inside a border is the padding. So let's give it a large right amount of padding. So I'm going to say padding. At the top, I'm just going to have what would work well, maybe just a quarter of an EM. So that's the top. On the right, I'm going to use a percentage measure, so it will be 80% across, and then I'm just going to use 0.25 on the bottom and a bit more on the left hand side. So 0.5 EM. If you remember, if you give 4 measures, it's like a clock. That's the top, right, bottom, left. So with that in place, let's see what happens. Well, it moves everything over 80%, just like I said, but because these are inside those, they get shoved underneath, which is not exactly what I want. I don't want these to be pushed around by this padding that's come over to this point here somewhere. So what can I do to stop those getting pushed around? Well, one thing I could do is there's a position type. Let me first say that if you're a label inside which you're an input, there's a position type that doesn't get pushed around by the rest of the elements in the document, and that is absolute, because when you position something absolute, it's taken out of the document flow. However, when it's taken out of the document flow, we want to position it according to a positioned parent, and its immediate parent of this label is the input. Let me just try and collapse this a little tiny bit because I realize it's going off the screen, so I'm just going to collapse those definitions. If I click on them, so I'll bring that back into your view. This input, its parent, is a label, so let's make the label position absolute, relative, sorry. So if this is position relative, it means position this absolute, it will be positioned with this as its position parent. Okay, so if we position it absolute, let's see what that does straight away. It's not in the document flow, so it doesn't get pushed around. But we want to do slightly more than just position it absolute. We want to actually then position it. So let's make its left position. We've moved the padding over 80%. So let's move this to the left, sort of a bit more than the 20% that's left over. So let's do that, and it just moves it along. Don't forget then the padding's over here 80%, and starting from this end we've pushed it this way just a little bit more than the 20% that was left over from that 80%, if that makes sense. So let's see what happens when I resize this browser. Should work reasonably well. It's dropped down. Why did it drop down? Well, it dropped down because I haven't actually positioned its top. I've positioned its left but not its top. So let's just give it a top position of just something small, again using relative measures based on the font size. So now you saw it move up fractionally perhaps. When I'm resized, look, it doesn't plop down. Now the only other thing I could do is I could make these a bit longer so they fill this space. So how can I make that? Well, I suppose I could choose a width measurement that's something less than the 80% that I've pushed things over. So let me save that version, and sure enough the inputs become 80%. Right, now in the example, I think that if you're following this on the course at the university, if you're following that, then we'd also got what did we got? We'd also got some radio buttons. So I'm just going to paste in a couple of radio buttons. Again, now let me collapse this so you can see that. So I've just pasted in there a couple of radio buttons. There, mine's 45 and 46. So let me save that and see what happens. Refresh, and that seems to work okay too, without any further intervention. I'm actually surprised that it works as well without any intervention, because I would have thought that those radio buttons would be over here because they'd have the same width as that. Not sure why that is the case, but what I would have normally done is where I've positioned a label as an input, I might well have overridden that and said, okay, if you're a label, which is an input, but not just any old kind of input, but that your type equals that you're a radio button, then I can override and say the width is actually not 75%, but it's auto. Maybe this varies according to browser, because I must admit I'm just trying out a different browser just out of interest, one called Brave. So let me just try that. It should look exactly the same, but I would imagine if I tried it in a different browser, those would be over here somewhere. Anyway, you get the idea, is that you can override a definition for a particular sort of input box if you want to. So it's as simple as that, really. We've just made these into blocks so they position underneath each other. We've put a large right amount of padding to push them over here, which also pushed these input boxes. So we took the input boxes out of the document flow by making them position absolute. But whenever you position something absolute, you usually want to be certain that their parent is positioned relative. Otherwise, when I measured the left or the top, it wouldn't be measuring from where the label is, it would be measuring from where the edge of the screen is. If it hasn't got a position parent, it goes up through the DOM tree and ends up positioning from the browser window. Okay, very quick explanation, but you can whiz and rewind it and listen to it again, and I hope you find that useful. Thanks a lot. Bye bye.